Hello, hello, hello. Just reading and talking recently with some people, and I realized that, the anarchist background that I come from is very much inspired by what was called the post left or post left anarchy or anarchism. And apparently, these days, people don't really know what that means. There was a recent discussion about it. Well, recent might not be the word, but there was a discussion about it on Anarchist News. And, I wanted to find one of the good texts to read about it. There's Bob Black's text, which apparently is where the term comes from. That one's called Anarchy After Leftism. And I didn't want to read that one. Instead, I wanted to read a text that was in Anarchy, a Journal of Desire Armed, which was a journal um, in the 90s all the way until a few years ago that had a lot to do with promoting the ideas of post-left anarchism. And in their 48th issue, it contained this text that I'm going to read by Lawrence Jarach, uh, from 1999, called Anarchists, Don't Let the Leftovers Ruin Your Appetite. And I was reading a little bit of it, and it seemed like a good read so far. The reason I'm choosing it over Bob Black's is just because it's a little more of the time period. And this is apparently, when post-left anarchism really took off. Actually, just because I'm curious, I'm going to see when that Bob Black text is from. So give me 1 second. Maybe I'll read that one later. The Bob Black text. Oh, it's actually from 1997. It's earlier, and it's from. I guess it's also a little bit longer. I think. Let me see. Yeah. So the Bob Black text is 82 PDF pages. This one was just in a journal. It's only 12 pages, so this is a little bit easier to read. But that doesn't mean I won't do the Bob Black one someday either. So, uh, oh, hey, what's up, parenthesis I? Yeah, I don't give a shit about any of the ideas about platforming or not platforming. One of the first interviews I did was with the, um, what are they called? The anarcho capitalists that were doing the anarcho poco thing in Mexico. And I got a bunch of shit for it. And actually, I eventually wound up taking it down, but it had nothing to do with the original shit I got. Apparently, they wound up inviting someone to that event that they already knew was a Holocaust denier. And then they invited them again the next year after I asked them about it. Yeah. So, in general, though, I mean, whatever. I'm not going to get into that. So, I'm going to read the text and yeah, we'll go from there. Anyway, this is Lawrence Jarach's Anarchists, Don't Let the Leftovers Ruin Your Appetite. Introduction. An uneasy relationship has existed between anarchists and leftists from the time Proudhon positively proclaimed himself an anarchist 150 years ago. From the 1960s through the 1930s, from the 1860s through the 1930s, most anarchists consider themselves to be an integral part of the international labor movement, even if there are moments of extreme conflict within it. Leftist anarchists saw themselves as the radical conscience of the left of the left, as it were. But since the death of 19th century anarchism on the barricades of Barcelona in May 1937, anarchists haven't had a movement to call their own. As a result, many anarchists trail after leftist projects, seemingly oblivious to the sometimes fatal historical rivalry that has existed between the two tendencies. They get seduced either by the seemingly anti authoritarian characteristics of such groups, like decentralization, or by the use of some anarchic vocabulary, direct action, for example. The most notable recent example is the widespread, uncritical anarchist support for and solidarity with the EZLN, Zapatista National Liberation Army. The name of the organization should be enough to cause anarchists to pause. National liberation has never been part of the anarchist agenda. The use of the Mexican flag at EZLN conventions makes it clear that the EZLN is a Mexican identified movement, not an international one. Their calls for fair elections within the context of Mexican history is quite radical, but it remains a statist demand, and as such cannot be anarchist by any stretch of the imagination. The EZLN, for all its revolutionary posturing, is a broad-based democratic movement for progressive social change within the fabric of the Mexican state. It is leftist, liberal, social democratic, postmodern, courageous in the face of overwhelming odds and official repression. You name it, but it is not anarchist. The Zapatistas don't refuse solidarity from anarchists, but to extrapolate from this fact that they themselves are anarchists or even anti authoritarians is wishful thinking at best. Characteristics are not the same thing as definitions. So I'm going to take a pause right there because I think I'm wondering how well that actually aged. You know, this was 1999. I think we've learned a lot about the EZLN, and they've changed since then. I mean, even recently, they restructured and increased the number of like decentralized units, and I think reoriented towards a more grassroots or decentralized configuration. Someone had a funny comment, but I'm not going to read it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, right. I'm reading this because of the influence it had, not because I agree with it. Um, and I don't know if I agree with it because it's been so long since I've read it that I don't remember it. So how would I know? Has there been any text critiquing Rojava from post-left perspective? I don't know about a post-left perspective, but I'm pretty sure there's been anarchist critiques of Rojava. Like, I think there's been a lot of them. Anyway, so anarchists and the international labor movement, part one. The initial place of rivalry between leftists and anarchists occurred was the First International in 1864 to 1876. Besides the well-known personal animosity between Marx and Bakunin, conflicts arose between the libertarian socialists and the authoritarian socialists over the ostensible goal of the International: how best to work for the emancipation of the working class. Using parliamentary procedures, voting for representatives, within a framework that accepted the existence of the state was the main tactic supported by the authoritarians. In the non-electoral arena, but remaining firmly within a statist agenda, was the demand of the right of workers to form legal trade unions. In contrast, direct action, meaning any activity that takes place without the permission, aid, or support of politicians or other elected officials was promoted by the libertarians. Strikes and workplace occupations are the best examples of this method. The leftists preferred persuasion and the petitioning of the ruling class, while the anarchists, recognizing the futility of this approach, preferred to take matters into their own hands, peacefully if possible, more insistently if necessary. Another rift had to do with the issue of nationalism, which was a reflection of the tensions between centralization and decentralization. For a majority of internationalists, nationalism was seen as a progressive force because it led to the consolidation and further industrialization of natural resources and the means of production. This, in turn, created a larger proletariat, and a larger proletariat meant a better chance of successful revolution. Most anarchists correctly saw nationalism as a force opposed to federalism, a basic organizing method of libertarians. These and other irreconcilable conflicts between the two tendencies, such as the place of the individual in the class struggle, led to the decline of the International. This dissolution began in the wake of the Paris Commune of 1871. By the time Marx was able to relocate the General Council to New York in 1872, far from the libertarian influence of the Spanish, French, and Italian sections, Bakunin and other leading anarchist activists had already been expelled from the organization. Individual anarchists were welcome to remain in the International, provided they dispensed with their anti-authoritarian principles. The First International became an anarchist-free zone for the last 4 years of its existence. The Social Democrats, Marxist or non-Marxist, but always anti-revolutionary, who began the work of creating the Second International from 1889 to 1914, already agreed, by the mere fact that most were members of legal socialist parties, that its methods were to be peaceful and lawful. They promoted universal male suffrage with the program of getting their members elected to legislative bodies in order to enact pro-union laws, eventually legislating socialism into existence. Despite the total absence of any discussion of direct action, federalism, or revolution, there were some anarchists, mostly syndicalists yearning for a big organization to join, who wanted to participate. They were rebuffed. The Second International was anarchist-free from the beginning. So pause there again, right before this section titled The Interlude, Anarchists in the Mexican and Russian Revolutions. What is this line up here where he says, another rift had to do with the issue of nationalism, which was a reflection of the tension between centralization and decentralization for a majority of internationalists. Oh, okay. That internationalists with a capital I, meaning members of the First International. Okay. The way that if you don't notice that that I is capitalized, it's like a totally contradictory sentence. For a majority of internationalists, that should be a majority of First Internationalists, maybe, or IWMA members, nationalism was seen as a progressive force because it led to the consolidation and further industrialization of natural resources. Okay. And then most anarchists correct on nationalism as a force opposed to federalism. Federalism here, meaning in the old sense, not in the sense of the United States, it would probably be a little more accurate to call it confederalism here, but then you have to deal with the history of that word here, so it's kind of fucked either way. Yeah. All right. So, long story short, anarchists were saying nationalism was bad. You can see this in Bakunin, in statism and anarchy. He has a really long uh, treatment of the topic of nationalism, whether it's pan-German or pan-Slavic or just generic, where, yes, he is basically saying that because it's a particularism and that it's fine to have a nationality, it's fine to care about that, but uh, what really matters is having the universal ideal, which was anarchy, or what socialism, the social revolution would probably be what he would say, and which is a whole topic about what the term the social question means. Actually, I kind of want to digress on this a little bit. So in this time period, and just in like uh a lot of political discourse in general, they use diplomatic language. And this is something that confused me for a long time. You have, the national question, you had the German question, you had the Slavic question, and famously, you had the Jewish question. And I think, um, you know, why understanding why things were titled like the blank question never really made sense to me until I finally started looking it up. And apparently, that's the way that diplomats handle, whatever their issues are, right? They classify them into different questions. So, right. Yeah, exactly. So it's like, um, I think a lot of people get the impression that if you even say the word like the Jewish question or something, that you're saying something anti-Semitic. But this is just the way that diplomats discussed issues. Like they'd be sitting around a table and, they'd look at their notepad and they'd be like, okay, what's on the agenda? We got the economic question, we got we got the Slavic question, we got the question of Italian unification, all this shit. So yeah, right, exactly. It's so someone said it's the blank question is a way of forcing a single solution on a complicated issue. And I think that's true because when you're in the context of making, you know, decisions with a bunch of other diplomats or, representatives of this or that power or country, yeah, you are trying to force a solution, a single solution. So it's a really weird way to frame things for anarchists. But what anarchists and socialists in general concentrated a lot on was something called the social question. And this is pretty much why when anarchists talk about the revolution that they want, they're saying they want a social revolution as opposed to a merely political one. So the social question, what does that mean? Does that like what was so the point of the social question was that when the industrial revolution happened, uh, pretty much everyone noticed that it had a lot of negative consequences related to pauperization or poverty, in other words, just the dissolution of uh, old traditional institutions and like all sorts of like terrible conditions for, the workers. So basically, the social question has been this question about the well-being of society uh, in general, as a in relation to the consequences of industrialization. So the social revolution is a revolution that takes place not necessarily in the realm of economics, but it is something broader and deeper than merely replacing the government. So it's really a transformation of the conditions of most of society. And this is, yeah. So that's when Bakunin's advocating the social revolution. That's what he's talking about. He's really talking about this, uh, this like qualitative change in society. And it's not just Bakunin. There's other socialists that frame the question that way. Anarchists didn't come up with this term, the social question. I think it goes back to like the early 1800s or something like that. Okay. So that was a ridiculous digression that did not need to happen. Interlude: Anarchists in the Mexican and Russian Revolutions. The Mexican Revolution began in 1910, primarily as a middle class rebellion against the corrupt and ultra conservative Porfiriato, the years of the rules of Porfirio Diaz. Anarchists were involved in the agitation to get rid of Diaz, most notably members of the PLM, Mexican Liberal Party, whose main theoretician was Ricardo Flores Magón. The PLM remained active throughout the revolutionary period. They tried to gain allies and supporters for radical land redistribution programs among the peasant armies of Villa and Zapata, Pancho Villa and Emilio Zapata, and to a larger degree were successful. Another arena of anarchist agitation was the Casa de Obrero Mundial, House of the World Worker in Mexico City. The Casa was the place where anarcho-syndicalists, revolutionary unionists, and socialists congregated. Their focus was on legalizing unions and other aspects of the industrial relations rather than on the agrarian question. There's another question. Even though the majority of Mexico's poor and working people were landless peasants. A majority of those involved in the Casa were adherents of a philosophical tendency that defined its members by the term cientificos, more or less scientists, rational, urban, civilized. As such, they were appalled by the use of the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe on the banners of the original Zapatistas. In addition, their constant collaborations with authoritarian socialists seemed to have weakened their adherence to libertarian principles. So much so that they became partners in the Red Battalions, which were organized by the center-left Constitutionalists to fight against Zapatistas. This was the first, but unfortunately not the last, seriously embarrassing and shameful episode of anarchist history when authoritarians took advantage of the gullibility of anarchists for their own benefit. Rather than uniting with the radical peasants in the countryside around a revolutionary program of total expropriation of landed estates and industries, in keeping with their pronouncements, the syndicalists of the Casa preferred to make common cause with their anti-radical, legalistic, leftist rivals to kill and be killed by peasant revolutionaries. Later, as the result of a general strike in 1916, the Casa and all unions were outlawed. Their more radical leaders were assassinated or imprisoned, and almost all urban revolutionary activities ceased. The new constitutionalist rulers understood that anarcho-syndicalists, the erstwhile allies of progressive leftists, could not be mollified as easily with promises of legal status as the authoritarian socialists, and the leftists didn't seem to mind too much that their libertarian rivals were out of the picture. The overthrow of the Tsarist regime in Russia in February 1917 was the development of 20th century leftism. Suddenly, political parties were decriminalized, political prisoners were amnestied, the death penalty was abolished. revolutionary activity mushroomed, dominated by the social revolutionaries, or SRs, in the countryside. The Bolsheviks, who were the left wing of the Russian Social Democratic Party, in the cities, and the armed forces and anarchists all over, their influence far out of proportion to their actual numbers. In the early months of the revolution, the SRs and the anarchists supported the slogan, "The land to the peasants, the factories to the workers." The Bolsheviks were hesitant about this slogan as a program since they were the heirs of the more cautious notion that the masses still needed to be led by technocrats and other smart people like themselves. But as the momentum and enthusiasm of revolutionary self-activity continued in the form of councils, Soviet in Russian, and factory committees, Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership adopted the slogan as well. Another slogan soon appeared: "All power to the Soviets." Each of the slogans was interpreted differently by the different revolutionary tendencies, of course. For anarchists and left SRs, the right SRs had previously split away from the revolutionary aspects of the SR program in favor of strictly parliamentary activity. The slogan, "The land to the peasants, the factories to the workers," meant just that. The peasants and workers would have total control over what they produced, how it would be produced, and how, when, and where it would be distributed. Federalism was the preferred method of organizing such a situation. For the Bolsheviks, however, such independent and decentralized self-activity was unthinkable. The state should decide how and when and where commodities were to be produced and distributed. Centralized planning was promoted as the only efficient and just way to control production and distribution. After the Bolshevik seizure of state power in October 1917, the approved revolutionary slogan became "All power to the Soviets," and that bothersome business about the land and the peasants and the factories and the workers was phased out. Similarly, there were unique interpretations of "all power to the Soviets" depending on party affiliation. To the Bolsheviks, this was a call for a government of representatives from the Soviets of workers, peasants, and soldiers, with the addition of party members who, together, would implement and guide the dictatorship of the proletariat. To the left SRs and the anarchists, the slogan meant a federation of Soviets and factory committees with or without delegates. For the anarchists, this also meant no state at all. The differences of interpretation turned into armed confrontation within 6 months of Bolshevik rule. The Soviets began to be turned into organs that merely ratified Bolshevik executive decisions, while the more independent factory committees were abolished. Anarchists and left SRs who pointed out this anti-revolutionary tactic were arrested by the Cheka and were imprisoned, and sometimes executed with counter-revolutionaries. In April 1918, the Cheka and regular police forces carried out simultaneous raids on anarchist centers in Petrograd and Moscow. The anarchists returned fire, but eventually surrendered. The surviving arrested anarchists were deported the following year. Meanwhile, the Ukraine from 1918 to 1921, the Makhnovist insurgent army was creating liberated zones for workers and peasants by encouraging and facilitating the expropriation of landed estates and factories while carrying out a total war against the whites being the monarchist counter-revolutionaries. Ukrainian nationalists, who were Republicans and socialists, and, on occasion, Trotsky's Red Army. Twice there were formal treaties made between the Red Army and the insurgent army, and twice the Bolsheviks broke their agreements when it suited their military and state policy, arresting, but most often executing, the insurgent anarchists. For the Russian anarchists who supported the Makhanovists, there were many who didn't, believing that a military structure was incompatible with true anarchist goals. This was the definitive end of their honeymoon with the Bolsheviks. In the spring of 1921, the Bolsheviks faced the most serious threat to their retention of state power and their pretense of being the party of the proletariat. There is a rebellion at the island naval fortress of Kronstadt, just off the coast from Petrograd. The sailors, soldiers, workers, frustrated with the intensely destructive policies of war communism, as well as the heavy-handed response of the Bolsheviks to a strike of factory workers in Petrograd, began a protest movement against government injustice. Their demands included an end to forced grain requisitions in the countryside, abolition of the death penalty, freedom of speech and press for all socialist groups, including anarchists, and open, that is, not dominated by the Communist Party, elections in the Soviets. Hardly any anarchists involved in the rebellion. Most had already been arrested or killed, and Kronstadt was a Bolshevik stronghold. But the complaints and the demands of the Kronstadters fell in line with anarchist critiques of the Soviet regime. Lenin and Trotsky issued many misleading denunciations of the rebels, often resorting to outright fabrications in their characterizations of its leaders. They were afraid of the appeal coming, as it did, from a bastion of approved revolutionary activity. Such a call for a decentralized, directly democratic program would have on a population weary of war communism, since the Civil War had been officially over for several months, yet still committed to the revolutionary slogans of all power to the Soviets and the land to the peasants, the factories to the workers. The Bolsheviks, preferring the methods of statecraft over revolutionary solidarity and compromise, attacked the island and massacred the rebels who survived the military suppression. Even for the anarchists who were willing to excuse the excesses of authoritarianism in the Bolshevik government, this was too much. Many left Russia voluntarily at around the same time that the dissident anarchists were deported, ridding the Communist Party of its most radical opponents. The Soviet Union was subsequently encumbered by the influence of anarchists. Unencumbered. All right, take another little break here. I don't know if I'm going to put this out as like an edited standalone reading, but yeah, I'm going to talk in between this shit and not worry about it. Doesn't look like there's much activity in the chat. I think, if you're familiar with anarchism at all, you're probably familiar with all that history that we just read. So not really a whole lot to comment on, but we could see that, the post-left position is basically starting off from this premise of what is, the question, what is the history of anarchist association with other left-wing groups been? Maybe we should reconsider this orientation. Okay. So let's go on to part 2, Anarchists in the International Labor Movement, part 2. In the aftermath of the consolidation of Bolshevik rule in Russia, the Third, or Communist International, was formed in 1919. Non-Russian anarchists, excited about the real possibility of revolution spreading around the world in the wake of the Russian Revolution, initially tended to overlook the centralized and authoritarian nature of the organization, much as their Russian counterparts had overlooked the same aspects of the Bolshevik state for the early years of its existence. At the time of the first conference of the Comintern, the majority of Russian anarchists were either dead or they were in prison, despite Lenin's assurances that there were no real anarchists in his jails, only criminals. Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman, and anarcho-syndicalists from around the world who were attending lobbied the Soviet government to release these so-called criminals from jail. The Russians were quietly released and expelled. Members of the American IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, and the Spanish CNT, National Confederation of Labor, declined to affiliate to the Comintern. Lenin's Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder was published in 1921, the same year of the suppression of the Kronstadt uprising, the final destruction of the Makhnovist insurgent army, and the libertarian communes of the Ukraine, and the adoption of the neo-capitalist New Economic Policy. This screed was aimed primarily at council communists and other independent revolutionary socialists, but charges of anarcho-syndicalist deviationism were thrown at all of Lenin's opponents. All those not uncritically supportive of the policies of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and its methodology of democratic centralism were declared to be objectively counter-revolutionary. The attempt to keep the international labor movement subservient to the orders of the headquarters in Moscow, of which Lenin's tract was the most public aspect, was nearly totally successful. The strategy of socialism in one tree was promulgated, and with centralized hierarchical discipline in place, the Comintern could be used to further Soviet foreign policy goals. Yeah, it's interesting that part was so short, because I think there's a lot more to be said about that, especially with like the IWW and the CNT. But okay. Yeah, I mean, I still, a lot of these critiques I still value a lot. I just, I'm a little less black-pilled on organizations than I used to be. So a specifismo seems decent to me. But otherwise, I still think that working with, like, in a real material way, other leftists is something that you need to be really fucking cautious about. And the criticisms of Antifa, were really influential on me as being like a popular front movements in general that are comfortable working with authoritarians of whatever stripe, as long as they're opposed to fascism. I think that's pretty much like just capitulating to a form of authoritarianism. Anyway, I feel the same way about anti-Zionism. I think that, the Popular Front kind of thing is really fucking bad. A united front, which is it's like at least committed to being anti-authoritarian or anti-capitalist, at least, is better. But ultimately, like, abandoning your specific principles, and wearing, like, putting on the same uniform to appear as a united force, to me, is a form of conformity and capitulation that's just not good for anarchists. Okay. Spain. The revolutionary response to the attempted military coup in Spain in July 1936 resulted in a protracted civil war between the defenders of the old monarchist order and the upholders of the 5-year-old parliamentary democracy. Members of the large anarcho-syndicalist CNT were put in an awkward position, supporting one form of government over another. Some chose to pursue revolutionary goals rather than become government anarchists, but the majority went for collaboration with the forces of legalism, some even entering the government by becoming cabinet ministers. Yes, that's right, anarchists entering into the government. At the time, the Comintern had adopted the anti-revolutionary policy of the Popular Front. This is what I was just talking about. Promoting parliamentary democracy in opposition to fascism through an alliance of Republicans, middle-class progressives, social democrats, and communists. This final abandonment of class struggle led directly to the May 37 communist-dominated Popular Front's armed suppression of the CNT and the anti-Stalinist POUM, Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. The two mass organizations in Spain at least nominally committed to some sort of revolution. The international labor movement was in the control of Stalinists for the next decade. All right, so I think we're going to get into a little less just review of history and start getting some like broad critique. Yeah, I think the Spanish anarchists that entered into the provisional government, I don't even know if they thought they could change it from the inside. I think they kind of thought that there was nothing else they could do. But I'd have to look into that. The author of the text that we're reading is really big on this criticism of the anarchists in the Spanish Civil War stuff, and I am not so familiar with a lot of the work. So, all right, the left. The left has consistently been identified with the international labor movement from the time of the First International. With the shift of focus from Western Europe toward Russia beginning in 1917 and continuing into the 1960s, leftists have identified themselves in relation to events that occurred in the workers' paradise. Whether a Leninist, Trotskyist, Stalinist, or non-Leninist communist, each variety of leftist has a particular view of when things went wrong or not with the Russian revolutionary experiment. For anarchists who considered themselves part of the left, even after the debacles of the internationals, this method of self-identification created a crisis. Whether to make accommodations to the politics of Leninism or to dispense with any and all hints of vanguardism. Most opted for the latter, but some, including the former Makhnovist Arshinov and Makhno himself, favored the militaristic vanguardism of the anarchist platform. Their more principled anarchist opponents, called the platformists, quote-unquote, anarcho-Bolsheviks, there actually were real anarcho-Bolsheviks, though, too, for whom it was merely a case of the unchecked authoritarian behavior of the Bolsheviks that led them to abandon the true revolution. The necessary existence, goals, and methods of a self-conscious, militarized, revolutionary vanguard were accepted in full. Such an analysis dispensed with the idea of a mass-based, self-organized revolution and substituted the armed action of a minority. This put the platformists firmly within a tactical framework of Leninism. This was not the first or last time that anarchists would flirt with the more authoritarian aspects of radical theory and practice. Many anarchists would disagree with this assessment of the platform. Yeah, I pretty much disagree with it. The main lesson of the anarchist press in relation to the first two internationals is that socialists prefer anarchists to be invisible and silent. That of the revolutionary experience of Mexico, Russia, and Spain shows that for socialists, the only good anarchist is pro-government or dead. Loyally fighting for a Mexican constitution didn't slacken the resolve of Mexico's rulers in outlawing and repressing anarcho-syndicalists who insisted on exercising their legal rights to organize radical trade unions. Helping to make revolutionary changes in cooperation with the Bolsheviks didn't protect the anarchists from the wrath of Lenin and his cohorts when the anarchists insisted on remaining attached to libertarian principles and tactics. Neither did being a part of a coalition of leftists and liberals in opposition to fascism shelter anarchists from the homicidal rivalry of Stalinists and Social Democrats 20 years later. I think there's been a lot of work, so I'm taking another break. I think there's been a lot of work on, like, academic work on the history of the platform, as well as, like, this whole development of a specifismo that gives me a little bit of a different perspective on it. Apparently, there was some, like, really bad translations of the platform when it initially came out, and those bad translations made it seem a lot more Leninist and a lot more authoritarian than it was really intended to be. And, a lot of the debate centers around that. And then there's, like, later things that people said about the platform. I think Malatesta and others that kind of, flesh out what its initial intentions were. Have anarchists ever identified with any of the other communist revolutions in ways similar to what they did with the Russian Revolution? Where there are enough anarchists, they have their own organizations. So I'll take these things one at a time. I don't know what anarchists did in Cuba, for example. We're as, like, English language anarchists, I think we're barely, like, 10 years into researching a lot of anarchist movements around the world, in Latin America, in China and Japan and elsewhere. Like, yes, so anarchists, I don't know how they responded to, communist revolution in China, but we do know at least that Mao was part of anarchist student groups beforehand, and was very influenced by them. So there were anarchists there. There's definitely, like, anarchists and nihilists in Japan. There's a lot of stuff being translated and coming out about that now. And, Latin America has got a huge anarchist movement by, like, Anglophone standards. That's a very old movement. A lot of anarchists went to Uruguay, Paraguay, places like that, during, like, the same time period that they were coming to, the United States. And, besides just the Mexican Revolution. And so there's been a lot of stuff around that. I mean, okay, so platformism did have a moment in the 2000s, and, like, the Northeast especially. But I think that was also a type of platformism based on some mistranslated texts. The period that we're both talking about, I believe, was before a lot of the academic work on this came out. I could be wrong about that, but I was pretty much a kid when that was happening. In 2001. In 2000, I would have been 15. So, like, I could not be remembering that all very clearly. So, okay, let's go into the 60s and 70s. The social upheavals beginning in 1968 ended the near total eclipse of anarchism in the years following the Spanish experience. In other words, this is something that I find very questionable. There's sort of like this idea that anarchism was pretty much like non-existent after it was crushed in Spain until 1968. But it's funny, a lot of the stuff I really like Herbert Reed, Alex Comfort, some of these British anarchists, and Paul Goodman. There's a lot of stuff. I don't know if Paul Goodman was an anarchist before the 60s, but he probably was. There was still anarchism around, but yeah, I mean, it didn't have like a mass movement in the English speaking world, at least. I'm not sure if that's true elsewhere. I think some of those big like anarcho-syndicalist unions in Latin America or whatever were still around in the 40s and 50s. But okay, back to the reading. So I'll start from the beginning. The social upheavals beginning in 1968 ended the near total eclipse of anarchism in the years following the Spanish experience. The formation of the New Left in the preceding few years, precipitated by examples of non-Soviet socialist alternatives, the Chinese, Cuban, Yugoslavian, Albanian, Korean, or Vietnamese models, resurrected an interest in unconventional and nonconformist aspects of political theory, which led to a renewed study of anarchist and non-Leninist revolutionary history. Tactics of anarchist organizing were adopted by non-anarchists because of their assumed inherent anti-hierarchical nature, in keeping with egalitarian presumptions, as was the trend of those early days. Consensus decision-making, affinity groups, rotating leadership, or lack of any and all formal leaders. These outward forms, characteristics, of quasi-egalitarianism were usually accompanied by the celebration of various nationalist movements that had emerged in the context of global anti-colonial struggles. Pause. And this is still, I think, really relevant to today, like probably even more so than 10 years ago. Unpause. Giving birth to an odd hybrid, pseudo-anarchic nationalist revolutionaries, activists who adopted the anarchist slogan, "Smash the State," while at the same time carrying the flag of the NLF, National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, a Stalinist popular front whose declared aim was the consolidation and centralization of the Vietnamese state. The anti-imperialists, some states are better than others, especially if they are in conflict with the United States. The problem, from an anarchist perspective, is that the goal of this strategy is to smash a particular state, not statism or government in general. The response of 60s militants to legal repression and the rise of third worldism contributed to the disintegration of the New Left, which began in earnest when the revolutionary potential of the working classes in imperialist countries was played down and eventually dismissed. This theoretical innovation was accompanied by the rise of urban guerrilla groups, the military actions of an elitist anti-imperialist vanguard were substituted for the self-activity of the masses, especially the working masses. The exploits of these violent militants superficially harken back to the years of anarchist propaganda by the deed: bank robberies, bombings, assassinations. Pause real quick. So this would be like the Symbionese Liberation Army or the Red Army faction. The people like that, these urban guerrilla groups that, like, if you think like, anyway, so that's the type of thing that he's talking about here. Unpause. From the mid 1880s through the 1920s, some anarchists engaged in spectacular violent and illegal actions. The idea behind this unorganized but widespread strategy was to prod normally complacent workers into mass revolutionary activity by showing the vulnerability of bourgeois society and of individual political and economic leaders in particular. It didn't work and was largely abandoned as counterproductive, but the popular association of anarchist with violence and mayhem was cemented. Pause again real quick. Even in the 1880s, during the propaganda by the deed era, a lot of those tactics were came out of nationalist movements as well. So this like history of urban guerrilla warfare, asymmetrical warfare, terrorism, and all that shit that gets associated with anarchists, a lot of it was also nationalists doing the same shit at that time. And so there's precedent for, nationalists to also be doing it later in the time period we're talking about now, without, having to refer to anarchist history at all. So, okay, the similar tactics of armed struggle groups and anarchists of the previous century led to the equation of the two tendencies in the analyses of many observers. As often as the media and various officials portrayed all violent political groups as anarchist, the groups themselves never tired of pointing out to anyone who would listen that they were not anarchists at all, but communists or socialists or progressives or nationalists or leftists. Having the actions of urban guerrillas fighting the imperialist state in solidarity with third world national liberationists equated with those of armed anarchists combating the state in solidarity with anyone, including themselves, who is oppressed by authoritarian social relations, regardless of the political ideology of their rulers, must have been maddening to the leftists of the 70s. Their ideological forebears had been struggling for the previous 150 years to be rid of the stigma of anarchism, only to have it foisted on them again because of a similarity of tactics. But the leftists had only themselves to blame for this confusion, since they had already appropriated an important term for the vocabulary of anarchism: direct action. Okay, another pause. So, yeah, I think, a mistake that people make is to associate tactics with political ideology in particular. You know, it's like, from the historical perspective, a lot of different political ideologies have done the same stuff. And whether you're talking about liberals and, the terror in the French Revolution or the Red Terror or whatever, it's, you know, or you're talking about these urban guerrilla groups or whatever, you see tactics spread around to different political ideologies because they're either effective or they're not. And unless you have like a principle opposition to the tactics from like a means and ends perspective, that usually means you're going to just be pragmatic and go with whatever works. Yeah, Paul Goodman's really fucking cool. There's a nice little documentary about him called Paul Goodman Saved My Life. Yeah, his stuff, Colin Ward, just a lot of the people in this time period. I think Paul Avrich, the historian, is also out of this time period. Those people had a big impact on me, more than um, people who were writing in the early 2000s really did, even more than Noam Chomsky. I guess you could also count him in there, though. Yeah, dude, it's so bad with this. Yeah, Alex Comfort. I mentioned him earlier, The Joy of Sex and other things. Same time period. I think he was like timeline wise sometime before Herbert Reed and after William Morris. Some people would kind of put him as a quasi anarchist. The birth of the arts and craft movement and stuff like that. Um yeah, so a lot of people will make this, like, look at something like Occupy Wall Street, or they'll look at, the Seattle Autonomous Zone, whether you call it the Chaz or the Chop or whatever, and they'll call these anarchist events, basically, or anarchist strategies. And it's bullshit, not only because anarchists are usually a minority in these um, events, but also because tactics are not what define anarchism, tactics alone. And for the most part, these aren't coherent. I've been on this rant before, but the participants aren't like all part of one or even like 5 organizations. The organizations tend to be a small portion of uh a more ambiguously ideological gathering of people that agree on the single issue, or like even the single attitude. It doesn't even have to be a single issue, right? Like Occupy Wall Street isn't necessarily a single issue, but it's orientation towards the bank bailouts and stuff like that. All right. Characteristics versus definitions. Hopefully I could get through this pretty okay, yeah, there's not much left. All right. In the anarchist tradition, the term direct action was never used as a euphemism for violence, unlike propaganda by the deed. It simply referred to any consciously political act that took place outside the realm of electoralism and other forms of statecraft. Decision making that uses mandated or revocable delegates instead of representatives, and creating mutual aid networks instead of relying on welfare are 2 examples. In a general sense, direct action refers to actions that encourage and expand the self-activity of any person or group without resorting to the institutions of the state. Polite or violent public protests, on the other hand, are undertaken in the hopes that policymakers can be influenced to implement legislative reform. This is the liberal/conservative or leftist/rightist strategy of appealing to political leaders' goodwill and or fear. Since this strategy relies on the actions of people not directly involved, it has nothing to do with an anarchist understanding of direct action. Pause here. A lot of people will call this anarcho-liberalism, which is kind of like this. So that accusation is just like pretty much trying to blame anarchists for not understanding like the importance of, it's like an inversion of what's really going on. These people aren't anarcho liberals. They're just liberals. They're who are using uh combat or combative strategies to do liberal shit. Anyway, registering public dissatisfaction with government policies by marching, demonstrating, fighting cops, destroying property, expropriating banks, liberating prisoners, assassinating political or industrial leaders is agitation and propaganda, not direct action. Look at that list again of all these things that are not direct action that anarchists are usually associated with: marching, demonstrating, even fighting cops, even destroying property. Expropriating banks is like arguably a little bit more direct action. Liberating prisoners, also, I don't know why these last three would not be considered direct action. Assassinating political and industrial leaders is agitation. So I think I know why that argument's being made from a historical perspective, but from a logical perspective, those last three are a little bit more direct action. The effects of such activity on creating and sustaining anti-hierarchical communities beyond the clutches of politicians are extremely limited. Right. So that second sentence is, you have to demonstrate that for some of those things in the list, in the array. It may make anarchism attractive to some people, which is exactly the point of propaganda by the deed or the idea. But the point of direct action is to become accustomed to making decisions using anti-hierarchical methods and then implementing positive egalitarian alternatives to statist ways of living. I think that, pause again, I think that there might be a little bit of crossover or like conflation here of the term self-help and the term direct action. Maybe those were actually terms that were conflated historically, and I'm not aware of that. But what he's describing as direct action here, I would call self-help, and put it as like a subcategory of direct action. Anyway, unfortunately, most activist anarchists have adopted the leftist usage of direct action, meaning any angry confrontation with the state, rather than the traditional anarchist definition, ignoring the state. This confusion is the result of substituting characteristics for definitions. That's a good way to put it. Anarchism has a definition. It is a discrete political theory and practice. To be an anarchist means to be against all government. A social change movement might be decentralized. It might use some form of direct democracy, the mandated delegate model, for example. It might call for international solidarity and use non-anarchist direct action in the leftist sense of using limited violence or property destruction to further their programs. But these characteristics of anti-authoritarian methods, these are characteristics of anti-authoritarian methods, not a definition of anarchism. If these tactics are used as part of a strategy for gaining legal recognition or influencing and or implementing legislation, then those who use them cannot be anarchists. Not because some self-appointed guardian of the ideology says so, but because anarchism is anti-legislative by definition. Anarchists are not frustrated liberals with an attitude, nor are they impatient authoritarian socialists unafraid to pick up a gun. All right, pause on that again. I'll probably be hopping off of here pretty quickly after I'm done reading it. Yeah, so I think I've seen Lawrence make this argument elsewhere about the usefulness of expropriations and stuff like that. And I think his argument tends to be more like, if you look at how much money anarchists have actually been able to expropriate from banks and things like that, it hasn't been significant enough to really aid in the construction of autonomous anarchist institutions, or whatever you want to call them. It's a lot of it has been symbolic. You rob the bank, and who knows how much money you actually got, but it's cool that you robbed the fucking bank type of stuff. And this is like, this criticism has of like expropriations or like militant or combative activity. Aragorn was making these critiques of this stuff all the way up to his passing away. And it's like kind of true. uh you know if it's a performative symbolic action in the end, how could you call it a direct action? And how could especially if you wind up getting arrested and then the milieu has to fucking foot the bill for your lawyers and your commissary and whatever when you're in prison. So it's it's debatable in that sense, but like in the sense of like, logically, if you're being able to fund, the stuff you're doing as anarchists that way, yeah, it's direct action. You're directly, without any government intervention or, representation or mediation, you're still directly creating the life that you want to live. Right. But the criticism is more that it's just ineffective and it's more for show than it is for its actual usefulness. Conclusions. Maintaining a minority position of principled anti-authoritarianism within a larger authoritarian framework, as anarcho-leftists insist upon doing in relation to the left, is naive at best. This brief historical survey has hopefully provided ample examples of the suicidal nature of such a project. Leftists want neither a loyal opposition nor a radical conscience, and they have made it abundantly clear over the last 150 years that they don't like anarchists and they prefer not to have them around, cluttering up their moves for polite and safely legislated social change or sudden military coups d'etats. Leftist anarchists consistently refuse to learn from the history of the interactions between their ideological predecessors and their desperately desired contemporary anti-anarchist allies. Involvement in non- and anti-anarchist fronts and alliances tends to make anarchists suspend the pursuit of their unique goals. Conflicts that have existed between authoritarian socialists and anarchists have not gone away, whether it's the tension between centralization and federalism, nationalism and internationalism, the role of the individual in relation to society and the state, or the more fundamental issue of statecraft, electoralism, agitating for legislative reform, etc., versus direct action. Anarchists stand in opposition to the issues and programs of all kinds of leftists. The leftist agenda is predicated on the use of legislation, representative government, and all of its coercive institutions, centralized economic planning by technocrats and other experts, and a commitment to hierarchical social relations. Promoting self-activity, egalitarian interpersonal and social relations, and cultivating a critical perspective are among the best aspects of anarchism. As such, they are worth extending. Accepting spoon-fed solutions and programs, engaging in non-reciprocal solidarity, emphasis on non-reciprocal, with leftists, and other characteristics of ideological myopia need to be discarded. Anarchists, with their emphasis on the principles of mutual aid, voluntary cooperation, and direct action, cannot share a common agenda with contemporary leftists any more than they could 150 years ago. A return to authentically anarchist principles, coupled with some understanding of the troubled history of the relationship between leftists and anarchists, can go a long way toward reinvigorating anti-authoritarian theory and practice. At the same time, moving beyond melioristic beliefs, especially about Western European technology, culture, and science, of 19th century anarchism, which have made the programs of anarchists and leftists seem similar, is crucial. The relevance of anarchist self-activity can only increase when the vestiges of authoritarian leftist assumptions and distortions are discarded from the words and behavior of anti-authoritarian activists, critics, and theorists. So Tobias has joined a little late into the reading of this text. I would recommend. Oh my! I didn't even have this shit on the whole time. Damn it. Well, now I got the marquee on the screen. I would recommend reading the text if you're just now catching up. Oddly enough, the black flag, that red flag, was also used by anarchists during the early days of the movement. And even the Circle A was something that apparently comes out of the 1960s. There was no Circle A before that in relationship with anarchism. The black flag is the more like long-standing symbol. I believe it was, if not used in the Paris Commune, then I think it was adopted for sure by the Makhnovists. Yeah, I think in the Paris Commune they still use the red flag. So the red flag wasn't necessarily just a communist symbol. It was a broadly socialist, or like a symbol of like working class aggression in a lot of ways. The black and red flag, I don't know when that became a symbol. I think it might have been the Spanish anarchists, the CNT or whatever, that started using that in the let's look that up. That's actually kind of interesting. Let's see. I don't know how Googleable this is going to be. So, yeah, let's just go over this article, I guess, real quick. And then I have to leave. I got somewhere I got to be. Okay, I'm going to the gym. But, yeah. So the red flag was one of the first anarchist symbols, widely used in the 19th century. Kropotkin said he preferred it. Louis Michel, wrote that the red flag frightens the executioners because it is so red with our blood. Those red and black banners wave over us, mourning our dead, and wave over our hopes for the dawn that is breaking. What was that from? Black flag. Wow, since the 1880s. Oh, okay. Several anarchist organizations and journals adopted the name Black Flag. That was in the... Oh, yeah, that makes fucking sense. Okay. The black flag is the negation of all flags. It is a negation of nationhood. Oh, don't fucking tell any of these nationalists that. Black is a mood of anger and outrage at all the hideous crimes against humanity, prepared in the name of allegiance to one state or another. But black is also beautiful. It is a color of determination, of resolve, of strength, a color by which All others are clarified and defined. So black is negation, is anger, is outrage, is mourning, is beauty, is hope, is the fostering and sheltering of new forms of human life and relationship on and with this earth. Its origins are uncertain. 1880s is pretty fucking early in anarchist history, though, so whatever. The bisected flag, this is the black and red one we were talking about. It's been in use since at least the late 1800s. When they were used on cockades. The fuck is a cockade? A cockade is a knot of ribbons or other circular or oval-shaped symbol of distinctive colors, which is usually worn on a hat or cap. Okay. So the Italian anarchists use black and red hat stuff. In the 1874 Bologna insurrection and in 1877 when anarchists entered the Italian town, Latino carrying red and black flags to promote the First International. Diagonally divided red and black flags were used by anarcho-syndicalists in Spain. That's right. Okay. So using red and black together is older, but that diagonal flag that we're all used to, this one, is, it comes out of Spain, the anarcho-syndicalists. The Circle A, something from like the 70s. The Black Cat's a really cool one that I love. 1890s. Yeah. All right. So, friends. I mean, I think a lot of people have used black flags and red flags and other stuff, not just anarchists. But yeah, I got to get ready to go to the gym. And by the way, Tobias, I still don't have an email with your book in it. So a reminder if you forgot. But yeah, I'm going to take off. So have a good day, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the reading of Lawrence Jarach's Don't Let the Leftovers Ruin Your Appetite. Definitely not an overview of all post-left anarchism, not even close. But it does argue some of the initial basic points of disagreement with the left and the call for a post-left. All right. So